My name's Ethan Miller, and for the past 8 years, I've worked myself to the bone trying to keep my wife, Veronica, happy. When we got married, I was a fresh-faced 24-year-old, ready to take on the world. Veronica was the kind of woman who turned heads everywhere she went, effortlessly beautiful, with a confidence that could make you forget your own name. I never imagined she'd marry someone like me, a guy from a modest background with nothing but ambition and a decent heart. But I wasn't wealthy, and I knew Veronica came from a family that valued money and status. My dad used to joke that I'd married above my station, but I brushed it off. I thought my hard work and devotion would make up for what I lacked in wealth. It worked for a while. We lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of town. I worked as a technician, pulling long hours to make ends meet, while Veronica stayed home. She used to talk about starting her own fashion line, her big dream. I believed in her. I believed in us. So, when she said she needed seed money for her dream, I started picking up overtime, taking shifts no one else wanted. The loans began piling up. First, it was for her sewing equipment. Then, there was the studio space she wanted to rent. Then, the marketing costs. Each time, she assured me it was just temporary. That once her line launched, everything would change. But the line never took off. Instead, Veronica's interest in her dream seemed to fizzle. I didn't push her about it. I didn't want to come off as unsupportive. She shifted her focus to yoga classes, weekend trips with her friends, and shopping sprees. Her new hobby became buying things we couldn't afford: designer bags, shoes, jewelry, always promising to return some of it but never actually doing so. Meanwhile, I was working 60, sometimes 70, hours a week. The bills were relentless: rent, utilities, credit cards maxed out in her name but paid with my sweat. We'd argue occasionally when I asked her to slow down on the spending, but she'd always have some excuse. "You work so hard, Ethan," she'd say, flashing that smile that used to make my heart race. "I just want us to enjoy life a little." I wanted to say that I wasn't enjoying life at all, that I was drowning. But I'd swallow my frustration because the last thing I wanted was to lose her. My breaking point came one morning when I received a call from the bank. The joint account we used for bills was overdrawn, again. I couldn't hide my anger when I confronted Veronica about it that night. "You need to stop this, Ronnie," I said. "We can't keep living like this. I've already maxed out my paycheck advances just to cover the rent." She didn't even flinch. She was scrolling through her phone, sitting on our overpriced leather couch, a glass of Chardonnay in her hand. "You're overreacting, Ethan. It's just a temporary cash flow problem." "A cash flow problem? Veronica, I've been eating ramen for lunch every day while you're out there buying $800 handbags." She rolled her eyes, setting her phone down. "I deserve nice things, Ethan. Is it such a crime to want a little luxury in my life? God, you make it sound like I'm out here gambling our money away or something." "It might as well be gambling," I shot back, my voice cracking under the weight of years of suppressed resentment. She didn't answer. She just sighed, grabbed her phone, and walked upstairs, leaving me in the living room with a stack of unpaid bills and a headache that wouldn't go away. That night, lying alone in our bed, I wondered how my life had turned into this. I was killing myself for someone who didn't even seem to care about the sacrifices I made. But every time I thought about walking away, I remembered the girl I fell in love with, the one who used to dance barefoot in our kitchen, laughing like she didn't have a care in the world. The one who used to call me her hero. I told myself things would get better. I was wrong, things didn't get better. If anything, they got worse. Veronica's spending spiraled further out of control. I started receiving calls from creditors about overdue payments on accounts I didn't even know existed. She had opened new credit cards under her name, and maxed them out within months. The money I was making wasn't just stretched thin, it was gone the second it hit the account. I tried talking to her again one Friday evening after a particularly brutal 12-hour shift. My body ached, and my head pounded, but I couldn't ignore the pile of letters from collection agencies staring at me from the kitchen counter. "Ronnie, we need to talk," I said, setting my work bag down. She was lounging on the couch in a silk robe, her nails freshly manicured and a glass of wine on the side table. She didn't even look up from the magazine she was flipping through. About what? These? I said, holding up the letters. You've been opening new accounts without telling me. Do you have any idea how much debt we're in? Veronica finally looked up, her expression unreadable. Why are you making such a big deal about this? It's not like we're bankrupt or something. Not yet, I said sharply. But that's exactly where we're headed if you don't stop. She stood, brushing imaginary lint off her robe as she walked toward the fridge to pour herself another glass of wine. You're always so dramatic, Ethan. I'm handling it. I followed her, my frustration boiling over. You're handling it? Ronnie, I'm working 70 hours a week just to keep our heads above water. Meanwhile, you're treating our bank account like it's your personal piggy bank. You don't even have a job anymore. She turned to me, her green eyes narrowing. Don't you dare throw that in my face. I gave up my career for this marriage, so I could support you and be here for you. Support me? Veronica, all you do is spend. I haven't seen you do anything remotely supportive in years. Her face darkened, and for a moment I thought she might throw the wine glass she was holding. Instead, she set it down with deliberate care and crossed her arms. You don't get it, do you? She said, her voice cold. You're not just working for you, Ethan. You're working for us. For me. That's what a man does, he takes care of his wife. And if you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't have married someone like me. The words hit me like a slap. Someone like me. Is that how you see me? I asked quietly. Just someone to pay your bills? She didn't answer. Instead, she picked up her glass and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there with the weight of her words pressing down on me like a ton of bricks. That weekend I decided I couldn't keep living like this without doing something to protect myself. I opened a separate bank account and started funneling a small portion of my paycheck into it. It wasn't much, just enough to give me a sense of security. I also contacted a financial advisor to explore my options. I didn't tell Veronica about any of it. She was already spending everything she could access, and I couldn't trust her with the truth. Meanwhile, her behavior grew more erratic. She started staying out late with her friends, coming home well past midnight with flimsy excuses about dinner running long. Sometimes she didn't bother coming home at all, claiming she'd stayed over at a girlfriend's place. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust her. But the nagging doubts in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. Then, one night, I found something I couldn't ignore. She had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was upstairs getting ready for one of her girls' nights. A text notification lit up the screen, and without thinking, I glanced at it. It was from someone named Mason. Mason, can't wait to see you tonight. I'll make it worth your while. My heart stopped. My hands trembled as I picked up the phone, staring at the message like it was a grenade about to go off. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe Mason was one of her girlfriends, and they had some inside joke. Maybe. But then another message came through. Mason, don't forget to wear that dress I like. You know, the one that drives me crazy. I felt sick. My chest tightened, and my vision blurred as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. I set the phone back down, careful not to disturb it. My mind raced, torn between confronting her immediately and waiting to gather more evidence. But before I could decide, she came down the stairs, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She looked stunning, dressed in a black cocktail dress that hugged her curves in all the right places. She smiled at me as she grabbed her purse, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. Don't wait up, she said lightly, leaning in to kiss my cheek. I froze, my stomach churning as her lips brushed my skin. I won't, I said, my voice hollow. As the door closed behind her, I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was going to do, but one thing was certain, nothing about my life was going to be the same after tonight. I didn't sleep that night. After Veronica left, I sat in the kitchen staring at her phone. I knew it was wrong to go through someone's private messages, but the doubt gnawed at me like a relentless parasite. I picked up her phone and unlocked it. She'd never bothered changing her passcode. There was a whole thread of messages from Mason. Mason, I can't stop thinking about last night. Mason, when are you going to tell him? I hate hiding like this. Mason, you're too good for him, Ronnie. You know that, right? And then, the one that cut me the deepest. Mason, I love you. She hadn't responded to that one yet, but the thread painted a damning picture. My wife, the woman I'd sacrificed everything for, wasn't just spending my money. She was spending her time, her energy, her love, on someone else. I scrolled further, my hands trembling as I pieced together their story. Mason was someone she'd met at one of her yoga classes. He was younger than me, a personal trainer who seemed to enjoy sending shirtless selfies of his toned abs. Veronica had responded to those pictures with heart emojis and playful comments. They had started seeing each other months ago. Mason would comfort her when I was too busy working to give her the attention she craved. Their texts were filled with plans to meet at fancy hotels and spend afternoons together while I was slogging through overtime shifts to keep our lights on. My stomach turned as I saw a series of pictures she had sent him. Intimate pictures. Pictures I hadn't seen. I couldn't read anymore. I locked the phone and set it back down, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I'd just uncovered. The woman I thought I knew was a stranger to me now. The next morning, Veronica acted like nothing was wrong. She hummed to herself as she made coffee, scrolling through her phone with a contented smile. I wondered if she even noticed that I hadn't slept, that I looked like hell. I'm meeting up with the girls for brunch, she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Don't forget to pick up the dry cleaning today, okay? I couldn't speak. I just nodded, afraid that if I opened my mouth, all the anger and hurt boiling inside me would come spilling out. She breezed out of the house like it was just another normal day, leaving me alone with my thoughts. By the time she came back that evening, I'd made up my mind. I needed proof. Not just for myself, but in case things escalated. I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. But I needed to be prepared. I hired a private investigator that week. His name was Tom, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor and a reputation for discretion. He didn't ask too many questions. He didn't need to. I told him I suspected my wife was having an affair and that I needed photographic evidence. Consider it done, he said, handing me a business card with his contact information. Over the next few weeks, Tom kept me updated with periodic texts. She's meeting him at the downtown Marriott, one message read. Dinner, drinks, checked into a room around 9 p.m. Another message. They're at a park near his place. Nothing too suggestive, but they're holding hands. Each update felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. And then came the pictures. The first was of her and Mason walking into a hotel lobby. She was wearing a dress I had bought her for our last anniversary. They looked like any other happy couple, laughing and holding hands. The second picture showed them at dinner, their faces close together, as they shared an intimate moment. The third, the one that broke me, was taken through the window of a hotel room. It was grainy, but there was no mistaking the silhouette of two people locked in an embrace. I stared at the photos for hours that night, my mind racing. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made, all the dreams I'd put on hold so I could give Veronica the life she wanted. And this was how she repaid me? By betraying me with some gym rat who probably couldn't even spell the word sacrifice? I tried to act normal around her, but it was getting harder to keep up the facade. She must have noticed something was off because she started asking me if everything was okay. You've been quiet lately, she said one evening over dinner. Is something wrong? I forced a smile. Just work stress. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer, and went back to scrolling through her phone. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was sitting across from me, the man who had given her everything, and texting him. The breaking point came a week later at dinner. We were eating takeout Chinese in the living room, the TV on in the background. I was halfway through my plate of General Tso's chicken when her phone buzzed on the coffee table. The screen lit up, and for the briefest moment, I saw the message before she snatched the phone away. Mason, come to my place. I want you. She froze, her eyes darting to mine as she clutched the phone to her chest. It's nothing, she stammered. A friend from yoga. I set my fork down and looked her straight in the eye. Don't lie to me, Veronica. Her face paled, and for the first time, I saw fear in her expression. That was the moment I knew there was no saving us. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I didn't even accuse her of anything. I simply stood up, walked to our bedroom, and started packing a bag. Ethan, wait! She called after me, her voice shaking. I can explain. There's nothing to explain, I said, my voice cold and detached. We're done. As I packed, I made a mental checklist. The joint accounts needed to be frozen. The credit cards needed to be cancelled. She wasn't going to spend another dime of my money. By the time I walked out the door, my mind was made up. I was going to file for divorce the next morning. The next morning, I was at my lawyer's office before they even opened. I sat in the waiting area, running through everything in my head. My hands trembled as I clutched the folder of evidence from the private investigator. The pictures, the time-stamped messages, the receipts, it was all there. Proof of her betrayal. Mr. Miller? A voice called from the hallway. I looked up to see Linda, my lawyer's assistant. She gave me a sympathetic smile and led me to the back office. My lawyer, Mr. Curtis, greeted me with a firm handshake. He was in his 50s, a no-nonsense man who came highly recommended for cases like mine. So, Ethan, he said, sitting down and adjusting his glasses. What brings you in today? I hesitated for a moment, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. Then I slid the folder across the table. My wife's been cheating on me, I said. Mr. Curtis opened the folder and flipped through the evidence. His expression remained neutral, but I could see the flicker of understanding in his eyes. You've got everything I need here, he said, closing the folder. Photos, messages, and you've already frozen the joint accounts? I nodded. This morning. She doesn't know yet. Good. That's the right move. Now let's talk about your options. He explained the process, laying out everything step by step. We'd file for a no-fault divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Given the evidence, we had leverage to negotiate terms in my favor. She wouldn't be entitled to spousal support, especially considering her spending habits and the debt she'd racked up. What about the house? I asked. We'll push for you to keep it, he said. But it depends on how much equity you've built and whether she decides to fight for it. I nodded, my mind racing. The house didn't even feel like a home anymore, but I wasn't about to let her take it from me. File it, I said finally. Let's get this over with. When I got home that evening, Veronica was waiting for me. She was sitting on the couch, her legs curled under her, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes wide with worry. Ethan, she started. Can we talk? I set my bag down and crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. Talk about what? She hesitated, biting her lip. About last night. About us. I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter, hollow sound. Us? You mean the us that you've been lying to for months? Or the us that doesn't exist because you've been screwing some guy named Mason? Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she was going to cry. But then, she straightened up, her eyes narrowing. I made a mistake, okay? She said defensively. I was lonely. You're always working, Ethan. You're never here. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to honor your vows, I snapped. You were supposed to talk to me if you felt lonely, not crawl into someone else's bed. It's not that simple, she shot back. You don't understand what it's like to feel invisible in your own marriage. You don't see me, Ethan. You never have. Her words stung, but I wasn't about to let her turn this around on me. Don't you dare try to blame this on me, Veronica. I've given you everything, everything. I worked myself into the ground to give you the life you wanted, and this is how you repay me? She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. It doesn't matter, I said. I've already filed for divorce. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. You what? You heard me, I said. The papers will be served to you soon. And just so you know, I've frozen all our joint accounts. You won't be spending another dime of my money. Her face turned red with anger. You can't do this to me, Ethan, she shouted. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to live? That's not my problem anymore, I said coldly. You wanted to be free? Well, congratulations. Now you are. I walked past her and headed upstairs, leaving her standing there in stunned silence. Over the next few days, the fallout began. Veronica's credit cards were declined when she tried to go shopping. The utilities were transferred to her name, and she was forced to call and make payment arrangements. I even had the locks changed on the house while she was out. She tried calling her friends for help, but most of them distanced themselves once they realized what had happened. Apparently, Mason wasn't the only one she'd been confiding in about our marriage. Her version of the story painted me as a workaholic who ignored her needs, but now that the truth was out, people were less sympathetic. And as for Mason? He didn't stick around. The minute Veronica lost her financial safety net, he ghosted her. She called and texted him repeatedly, but he didn't respond. She even went to his gym to confront him, but he made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her anymore. I heard about all of this through Tom, who kept me updated on her activities. It was petty, I knew, but there was a part of me that took satisfaction in watching her life fall apart. But the satisfaction didn't last long. At the end of the day, all I felt was emptiness. I had built my entire life around someone who never really loved me, and now I was left to pick up the pieces. One night, Veronica showed up at my new apartment. She was crying, begging me to give her another chance. I made a mistake, she sobbed. I was stupid and selfish, but I love you, Ethan. Please don't throw everything away. I looked at her, and for a moment, I almost believed her. Almost. But then I remembered the texts, the pictures, the months of lies and betrayal. No, Veronica, I said quietly. You threw it away. Not me. And with that, I closed the door. The weeks after I closed the door on Veronica were some of the strangest of my life. I thought I'd feel triumphant. I thought walking away from her and the mess she'd made of our marriage would feel like freedom, like I'd finally won. But there was no sense of victory. Instead, there was a void, a deep, gnawing emptiness that left me wondering what all those years of sacrifice had been for. I threw myself into work, using the long hours to drown out the thoughts that kept creeping in during the quiet moments. The factory became my sanctuary. Overtime wasn't just about making ends meet anymore. It was a distraction, a way to keep from facing the reality of my broken life. But no matter how hard I worked, the silence always caught up with me. The apartment I'd rented after leaving Veronica was small and sterile. The walls were bare, the furniture second-hand. I kept telling myself it was temporary, but every night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, it felt permanent. The only thing I took from the house was a single photo of us from our honeymoon, tucked away in the back of a drawer. I couldn't bring myself to throw it out, even though looking at it made my stomach churn. One evening, about a month after the divorce papers were filed, I got a call from my lawyer. Ethan, Mr. Curtis said, his tone calm and professional. We've received a response from Veronica's attorney. I closed my eyes, bracing myself. What does she want? She's contesting the division of assets, he said. She's claiming that she contributed to the marriage by managing the household and supporting your career, so she's entitled to a larger share of the property and finances. I let out a bitter laugh. She supported me? By spending money we didn't have and screwing another guy on the side? I understand your frustration, Curtis said, his tone measured. But the court doesn't consider infidelity when dividing assets in a no-fault divorce state. We'll need to build a case to demonstrate her financial irresponsibility. That won't be hard, I said, thinking about the pile of credit card statements and Tom's reports. She's also requesting spousal support, he added, almost as an afterthought. That hit me like a punch to the gut. She wants alimony? After everything she's done? I know it's frustrating, but this is common in cases like yours. We'll fight it, of course, but I want you to be prepared for a lengthy process. She's clearly trying to drag this out. My jaw tightened as I gripped the phone. Of course she was. Veronica had always known how to push my buttons, how to make me suffer when things didn't go her way. This wasn't about fairness or justice, it was about control. Do whatever you have to do, I said. Just make sure she doesn't get a damn cent more than she deserves. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, documents, and court preparations. Veronica's lawyer was a shark, and she played the victim card with expert precision. She claimed she had been a supportive wife who had sacrificed her own career aspirations to help me succeed. She painted herself as a homemaker who had dedicated her life to maintaining the household, conveniently leaving out the part where she spent more time at boutiques and yoga studios than she ever did cleaning or cooking. Every time I saw her in court, sitting across from me with that practiced look of sorrow on her face, my blood boiled. How could someone who had torn my life apart act like the victim? But then, every so often, her mask would slip. One day, during a break in the proceedings, I overheard her talking to her lawyer. "He's so predictable," she said with a sneer. "Ethan's always been desperate to look like the good guy. He'll cave eventually. Just watch." She didn't know I was standing nearby. When she finally noticed me, her expression faltered for a split second before she turned away, pretending not to care. That was the moment I realized she hadn't changed, not even a little. The final hearing dragged on for hours. Veronica's lawyer argued that she deserved a significant portion of the marital assets to maintain the lifestyle she had become accustomed to. My lawyer countered with evidence of her spending habits, the debts she had accrued, and her complete lack of financial contribution to the marriage. When the judge finally delivered the ruling, it was a mixed bag. The house was sold, and the proceeds were split. I kept my car, my savings, and the small retirement fund I'd managed to squirrel away. She got her credit card debts wiped clean, a modest cash settlement, and the furniture she had picked out. She didn't get alimony. That was the one victory I could cling to. After the hearing, I walked out of the courtroom feeling nothing. No relief. No anger. Just a hollow sense of finality. A week later, I got an email from Tom, the private investigator. He'd followed up on Veronica's activities after the divorce was finalized. Apparently, Mason had left town. The texts she sent him were desperate, pleading, begging him to come back, but he never replied. She'd moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, scraping by on whatever she could find. Most of her so-called friends had vanished when her lifestyle crumbled. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. That night, I sat on the couch in my apartment, staring at the blank wall in front of me. The silence was deafening, but this time, it didn't feel oppressive. It felt peaceful. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and raised it in a quiet toast. "To new beginnings," I muttered. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. The weeks after the divorce were a strange mix of relief and regret. On the surface, I was free. The chains of my toxic marriage had been broken, and for the first time in years, I wasn't working just to keep someone else happy. But freedom came at a cost. The silence in my apartment wasn't peaceful for long, it became haunting. Without the constant chaos Veronica brought to my life, I was left alone with my thoughts, and they weren't kind. At night, I would lie awake, replaying every argument, every red flag I had ignored, every sacrifice I made for someone who didn't deserve it. I tried to distract myself. Work, as always, became my escape. My boss noticed I was taking every shift I could get, and even pulled me aside one day. "Ethan," he said, his tone careful, "I don't know what's going on in your personal life, but you're running yourself into the ground. Maybe you should take a day off. I nodded, but I didn't listen. Work was the only thing that kept the loneliness at bay. Veronica, meanwhile, had all but disappeared from my life. Aside from the occasional email from my lawyer about finalizing paperwork, I heard nothing from her. Tom's updates stopped too. There was no point in keeping tabs on her anymore. But then, one evening, I got an unexpected phone call. "Ethan," the voice on the other end said. It was Veronica's mother, Elaine. Hearing her voice was like a punch to the gut. Elaine had always been kind to me, treating me more like a son than a son-in-law. I hadn't spoken to her since before the divorce, and part of me had hoped I never would again. "Elaine," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I wanted to apologize," she said finally. "For everything." I frowned, unsure how to respond. "You don't have to apologize for Veronica's choices." "No," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I do. I raised her. I should have done better." Her words caught me off guard. Elaine had always been proud of Veronica, always quick to defend her. Hearing her take responsibility was the last thing I expected. "She's struggling, Ethan," Elaine continued. "She made mistakes, terrible ones, but she's paying for them now. She's lost everything. Mason's gone, her friends have abandoned her, and she doesn't even have enough money to cover her rent." I closed my eyes, the familiar anger bubbling up inside me. "Elaine, I understand you care about her, but she made her bed. Now she has to lie in it." "I know," Elaine said quietly. "But I just thought you should know." The line went silent after that, and I hung up, feeling more conflicted than ever. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey, replaying Elaine's words in my head. I couldn't deny that there was a small, petty part of me that was glad Veronica was struggling. After everything she had put me through, it felt like karma. But there was another part of me, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, that felt guilty. I had loved her once. Despite everything, there had been a time when she was my whole world. Seeing her fall apart, even from a distance, stirred something in me. I poured another drink and pushed the thoughts away. The next day, I ran into an old friend at the grocery store. Mark had been one of my groomsmen at the wedding, but we had drifted apart over the years. He looked surprised to see me. "Ethan? Man, I haven't seen you in ages." We talked for a while, catching up on each other's lives. When I mentioned the divorce, Mark shook his head in disbelief. "Damn," he said. "I'm sorry to hear that. I always thought you and Veronica were solid." "Yeah," I said bitterly. "So did I." Mark hesitated, then placed a hand on my shoulder. "Listen, I'm having some people over this weekend. You should come. It'll be good for you to get out, meet some new faces." I started to decline, but something in his tone stopped me. Maybe he was right. Maybe I needed to stop wallowing in my misery and try to rebuild my life. "I'll think about it," I said. When Saturday rolled around, I found myself standing outside Mark's house, feeling awkward and out of place. I hadn't been to a social gathering in years. Veronica had always been the one to drag me to these things. But once I stepped inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. Mark introduced me to a few of his friends, and before long, I was laughing and sharing stories like I hadn't in years. That's when I met Rachel. She wasn't flashy or over the top like Veronica. She was simple, down to earth, with a kind smile and an easy laugh. We talked for hours that night, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't think about my ex-wife. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, life began to feel normal again. I started seeing Rachel more often, taking things slow and savoring the simplicity of our time together. She wasn't like Veronica. She didn't expect grand gestures or expensive gifts. She valued the little things, a home-cooked meal, a quiet evening on the couch, a walk in the park. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. But even as I moved forward, there was still a part of me that couldn't fully let go of the past. Veronica's shadow loomed large, a constant reminder of the mistakes I had made and the lessons I had learned the hard way. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment with Rachel, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to ruin the moment. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Not because I miss her, but because I don't ever want to make those same mistakes again." Rachel nodded, her hand resting gently on mine. "That's all you can do, Ethan. Learn from it and move forward." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally doing just that. It's funny how life has a way of pulling you back into the very things you've tried so hard to escape. Just when I thought I'd left Veronica and everything she represented behind, the past had a way of finding its way back to me. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was at work, halfway through installing a new piece of machinery, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it at first. I had a policy about not checking personal calls on the job. But when it buzzed again, and then again, I finally stepped away to see what the commotion was about. 3 missed calls. All from Elaine. I hadn't heard from Veronica's mom since that one call months ago, and seeing her name on my screen sent an uneasy ripple through me. I hesitated, debating whether to call her back. Curiosity, and a nagging sense of obligation, won out. "Elaine," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Is everything okay?" There was a long pause on the other end before she spoke. "Ethan, I didn't know who else to call. It's about Veronica." My stomach tightened. "What about her?" She's not doing well," Elaine said, her voice trembling. "She's been staying with me for the past couple of weeks. She's barely eating, barely speaking. She's not the same person anymore." I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. "Elaine, I'm sorry she's struggling, but I don't know what you expect me to do about it. We're not married anymore. She made her choices." "I know," Elaine said quickly. "And I'm not asking you to take her back or anything like that. I thought maybe hearing from you might help her. You were such a big part of her life, Ethan. Maybe you could get through to her in a way I can't." My first instinct was to say no. To hang up and let Elaine deal with the mess her daughter had made of her life. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the years I'd spent loving Veronica, or maybe it was the faint echo of guilt that still lingered in the back of my mind. "I'll think about it," I said finally. That evening, I told Rachel about the call. We were sitting on the couch, eating takeout and watching a movie. She paused the TV when I mentioned Elaine's request, turning to me with a concerned expression. "How do you feel about it?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants nothing to do with Veronica. She put me through hell, and I've worked too hard to move on. But then there's another part of me that feels responsible somehow. Like maybe I owe her this one thing." Rachel reached out and took my hand, her touch grounding me. "You don't owe her anything, Ethan. But if you feel like you need closure, or if you think it might help you move forward, it might be worth considering." Her words stuck with me. The next day, I found myself driving to Elaine's house. I didn't know what I was going to say or how I was going to feel seeing Veronica again, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my chest. Elaine greeted me at the door, her face lined with worry. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. She led me to the living room, where Veronica was curled up on the couch. She looked different. The confident, glamorous woman I had once known was gone. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale and gaunt. She wore an old sweatshirt and leggings, a far cry from the designer outfits she used to flaunt. She glanced up when she saw me, her eyes widening in surprise. "Ethan?" I nodded, staying by the doorway. "Elaine said you weren't doing well?" Veronica sat up slowly, her movements lethargic. "I didn't think you'd come." I crossed my arms, keeping my distance. "What's going on, Veronica?" She let out a bitter laugh. "What do you think?" "My life's a mess. Mason's gone, my friends have all moved on, and I'm stuck here, living with my mom." "That's not surprising, considering how you treated people," I said bluntly. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let myself feel anything. Not sympathy, not pity. Nothing. I know I messed up, she said, her voice breaking. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I don't know how to fix this, Ethan. I don't know how to fix me. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Veronica, I can't fix you. That's something you have to do for yourself. I tried to help you for years, and all you did was take and take until there was nothing left of me. I'm not here to save you. She flinched at my words, her tears spilling over. I'm sorry, she whispered. For everything. I know that doesn't mean much now, but I wish I could take it all back. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to walk out and leave her to figure it out on her own. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the good times, the love we once shared, felt compelled to give her something. Look, I said finally. You need to stop wallowing and start rebuilding. Get a job. Pay your bills. Go to therapy if you have to. But don't sit here expecting someone else to fix your problems. That's what got you here in the first place. She nodded, her face crumpling as she sobbed into her hands. I turned to leave, but before I walked out, I glanced back at her. I hope you figure it out, Veronica. I really do. But this is the last time I'm stepping into this mess. You're on your own now. And with that, I walked out the door, closing it behind me. On the drive home, I felt a strange sense of relief. Seeing Veronica like that, broken and vulnerable, didn't fill me with satisfaction like I thought it might. Instead, it reminded me of why I left and why I could never go back. When I got back to my apartment, Rachel was waiting for me. She didn't ask what happened. She just wrapped her arms around me and held me close, letting me feel the weight of everything without having to explain it. For the first time, I felt like I could finally let go of the past. After my final visit to Veronica, something shifted in me. I don't know if it was closure or just the realization that there was nothing more to salvage, but for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The weight of her betrayal no longer crushed me. The following weeks were like stepping into unfamiliar territory. I was rebuilding a life that didn't revolve around her, and while it felt strange at first, it was also liberating. I threw myself into work again, but this time, it wasn't an escape. It was about creating something for myself. The overtime wasn't just for paying bills or digging out of debt, it was for my future. I started saving for a down payment on a house, one that would be mine, untouched by memories of my past. Rachel was a big part of that transformation. She wasn't just someone to fill the void Veronica left behind, she was someone who genuinely cared. Her presence in my life felt easy. There was no constant drama, no emotional manipulation. Just two people enjoying each other's company. One night, as we were sitting on the couch after dinner, Rachel turned to me with a curious look. Do you ever think about starting over? She asked. Starting over how? I asked, though I already had an idea of what she meant. Like a clean slate. Moving somewhere new. Buying a house. Building a life that's entirely yours. Her words stuck with me. I'd been saving money, but I hadn't seriously considered moving yet. My apartment was small and temporary, sure, but it was familiar. The thought of uprooting my life felt daunting. But the more I thought about it, the more appealing it sounded. I've been thinking about it, I admitted. I just don't know where to start. Rachel smiled. You've already started, Ethan. You just don't realize it yet. A few weeks later, I found myself sitting across from a real estate agent, flipping through listings of houses in the area. It felt surreal. I hadn't planned on making such a big move so soon, but Rachel's words had planted a seed, and now I couldn't stop thinking about the possibilities. Most of the houses were out of my price range, but there was one that caught my eye, a small, single-story home on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy, with a big backyard and enough space to feel like a fresh start. When I toured the house, I knew it was the one. The walls were a blank canvas, the floors scuffed, and in need of refinishing. The backyard was overgrown, but I could already picture myself sitting out there on summer evenings. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It was mine. Closing on the house felt like a milestone, a tangible symbol of everything I had been through and everything I was working toward. The day I got the keys, Rachel came with me to see it. "You're really doing this," she said, her voice filled with pride as she stood in the empty living room. "Yeah," I said, looking around. "I guess I am." She turned to me, her eyes soft. "You deserve this, Ethan. You deserve to be happy." For the first time, I started to believe her. Moving into the house was a process. It wasn't just about unpacking boxes, it was about making the space feel like home. I spent weekends sanding floors, painting walls, and clearing out the overgrown backyard. Rachel helped when she could, but she knew I needed to do most of it on my own. It was therapeutic in a way, watching the house transform piece by piece. Each project felt like another step toward reclaiming my life, toward building something I could be proud of. One afternoon, as I was digging up weeds in the backyard, Rachel brought out 2 glasses of lemonade and sat down on the porch steps. "You've got a green thumb," she said with a grin. "Not yet," I said, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "But I'm getting there." She tilted her head, studying me for a moment. "I like seeing you like this. Happy." I paused, leaning on the shovel. "I think I am," I said honestly. For the first time in a long time. As the weeks turned into months, my new life began to take shape. I reconnected with old friends, joined a local hiking group, and even started taking guitar lessons, a hobby I had given up years ago because I never had the time. I was no longer the man who had been defined by his marriage or his divorce. I was just Ethan. One evening, Rachel and I were sitting in the backyard, watching the sunset. The house was mostly finished by then, and the yard had been transformed into a lush, peaceful retreat. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Rachel asked, her voice soft. "Next?" I asked, turning to her. "For us," she said, her cheeks flushing slightly. I took her hand in mine, my heart swelling with a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: hope. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I'm not afraid of it anymore." She smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Life has a funny way of moving forward, whether you're ready for it or not. As much as I tried to wallow in the past, the universe seemed determined to remind me that it wasn't over. There was still so much more waiting for me, if only I was brave enough to reach for it. The house became my sanctuary. What started as a small, modest fixer-upper had grown into a reflection of my new life. The walls, once scuffed and bare, were now painted in warm tones. The backyard, once overgrown and wild, had been transformed into a lush garden with a fire pit where Rachel and I spent our evenings talking and laughing under the stars. And Rachel, she had become more than just someone I was seeing. She was my partner, my confidant, and the person who reminded me that life didn't have to be complicated to be good. One Sunday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee wafting through the house. Rachel was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she flipped pancakes. The sight of her in my oversized hoodie, her hair messy from sleep, made my chest tighten in a way that was both familiar and completely new. "Good morning," she said, flashing me a smile as I leaned against the doorframe. "Morning," I said, my voice still rough with sleep. "You didn't have to do all this." She shrugged. "I felt like it. Besides, you deserve a little spoiling for a change." Her words struck a chord in me. It had been so long since I felt like someone cared for me without expecting something in return. As we sat at the table, eating pancakes and drinking coffee, I found myself staring at her, wondering how I'd gotten so lucky. "What?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Nothing," I said, shaking my head. "I'm just happy." Her smile widened, and she reached across the table to take my hand. "Me too." Later that day, we took a drive out to the countryside. Rachel loved exploring, and I loved the way her eyes lit up whenever she found a new hidden gem. We stumbled across a small farmer's market nestled in a clearing, surrounded by rolling hills. Vendors sold everything from fresh produce to handmade crafts, and the air smelled of lavender and freshly baked bread. Rachel dragged me from stall to stall, her excitement infectious. She bought a jar of honey from a local beekeeper, a bundle of wildflowers, and a handmade wooden frame. "This would look great in your living room," she said, holding up the frame. "Our living room," I corrected without thinking. Her eyes softened, and she smiled. "Our living room, huh?" I felt a surge of panic, wondering if I'd said too much, but then she looped her arm through mine. "I like the sound of that," she said softly. The next few months were some of the best of my life. I had found a rhythm, a balance between work and home that felt sustainable. Rachel and I spent more and more time together, and it wasn't long before her toothbrush found a permanent spot in my bathroom and her favorite books started filling my shelves. It wasn't a big conversation or a dramatic moment, it just happened naturally, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. One evening, as we sat by the fire pit in the backyard, Rachel turned to me with a serious expression. "Ethan," she said, her voice steady, "I need to ask you something." "Shoot," I said, taking a sip of my beer. "Do you think you'll ever want to get married again?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't given much thought to marriage since the divorce. It was still a sore subject, a wound that hadn't completely healed. "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I haven't really thought about it. After everything with Veronica." I trailed off, not wanting to bring the conversation down. Rachel nodded, her gaze fixed on the fire. "I get that. And I'm not saying we have to figure it out right now. I needed to know where your head's at." I reached over and took her hand, threading my fingers through hers. "I can't promise I'll ever be ready for that again," I said honestly. "But what I can promise is that I'll always be honest with you. And that I want us, to keep growing." Her eyes met mine, and she smiled. That's all I needed to hear. As time went on, I found myself thinking more and more about her question. Marriage wasn't something I was ready to jump into again, but the idea of a future with Rachel, that was different. One Saturday morning, I found myself wandering into a small jewelry store downtown. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just something that would show her how much she meant to me. The saleswoman showed me a simple gold necklace with a small, heart-shaped pendant. It wasn't flashy or extravagant, but it was elegant, just like Rachel. When I gave it to her that evening, the way her eyes lit up made me feel like I'd done something right for the first time in a long time. "I love it," she said, hugging me tightly. "I love you," I blurted out before I could stop myself. She pulled back, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment I thought I'd scared her off, but then she smiled, the kind of smile that made everything else fade away. "I love you too," she said, her voice soft but sure. And just like that, the walls I'd built around myself started to crumble. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. Rachel wasn't just a part of my life, she was becoming the best part of it. For the first time in years, I felt like the future was something to look forward to, not something to fear. The first anniversary of my divorce came and went without fanfare. It wasn't something I wanted to celebrate, but it did make me pause and reflect on how much my life had changed in just a year. I thought about the person I was back then, tired, defeated, a shadow of myself, and how far I'd come since. I wasn't the same man who had poured everything into a marriage that drained him. I was someone new, someone stronger. And I wasn't alone anymore. Rachel was still by my side, and our relationship had grown into something I never thought I'd have again. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and real. She grounded me in ways I didn't know I needed, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was part of a team instead of fighting battles on my own. One day, as I was working in the backyard, Rachel came outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to me and sat on the steps, watching as I cleared the last of the weeds from the flower bed. "You've turned this place into something amazing," she said, her voice filled with admiration. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and looked around. The garden was finally taking shape, flowers blooming along the edges, a vegetable patch sprouting green shoots, and a small fountain bubbling softly in the corner. "It's getting there," I said. She smiled, taking a sip of her coffee. "I was thinking maybe we could plant a tree. Something that'll grow over the years, like we are." The idea struck a chord with me. Planting a tree felt symbolic, like a promise to the future. "I like that," I said. We went to a nursery the following weekend and picked out a young oak tree. It was small, barely taller than me, but the nursery owner assured us it would grow strong with the right care. We planted it together in the center of the backyard, taking turns digging the hole and steadying the sapling as we filled the dirt back in. When we were finished, we stood back to admire our work. "It's perfect," Rachel said, slipping her hand into mine. "It is," I agreed, though I wasn't sure if I was talking about the tree or us. As time went on, I found myself thinking more and more about the future. Rachel had asked me once if I thought I'd ever want to get married again, and while I wasn't ready to answer then, the idea didn't scare me anymore. One evening, as we sat by the fire pit, I brought it up. "Do you still think about getting married?" I asked, my gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Rachel glanced at me, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I'm not in a rush. I'm happy with where we are right now." Her answer was honest, and it put me at ease. There was no pressure, no expectation, just an understanding that we were building something together, one step at a time. In the months that followed, life settled into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Work was steady, the house felt like home, and Rachel and I continued to grow closer. But every now and then, the past would creep back in. One evening, as I was sorting through some old boxes, I came across a photo album from my marriage to Veronica. For a moment, I considered tossing it in the trash, but something made me stop. I flipped through the pages, seeing the smiles and laughter frozen in time. It was strange. Those moments had felt so real back then, but now they seemed like they belonged to someone else. I closed the album and set it aside, not ready to throw it away but not interested in keeping it either. It wasn't about holding on. It was about acknowledging that those years were a part of my story, even if they weren't the ending. One day, Rachel and I were sitting on the back porch, watching the oak tree sway gently in the breeze. She leaned her head on my shoulder, her fingers tracing lazy circles on my arm. "You're quiet today," she said. "What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, letting the words settle in my chest before I spoke. "Do you ever feel like you had to go through something terrible to get to where you are now?" Rachel sat up, her eyes searching mine. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think we all do, in one way or another. The hard stuff shapes us. It doesn't define us, but it makes us stronger." Her words resonated with me. I thought about everything I'd been through, the years of sacrifice, the betrayal, the heartbreak, and realized she was right. Those experiences hadn't broken me. They had reshaped me into someone who could appreciate what I had now. "I don't think I would have ended up here without all of it," I said. "As much as it hurt, maybe it had to happen." Rachel smiled, her hand finding mine. "Then I guess we should be grateful for the hard stuff, huh?" "Yeah," I said, squeezing her hand. "I guess we should." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a deep sense of peace. The oak tree stood tall in the center of the yard, its branches reaching toward the sky like a promise to the future. Rachel rested her head on my shoulder again, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just moving on, I was moving forward. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't define me. And as I sat there with Rachel, watching the stars begin to emerge, I knew that the road ahead was one I was ready to walk. Together.